You know, it's getting chilly out there. You might even say it's cloak season. And I don't have a cloak, so of course that means I have to make one, right? There's no places where you can buy items in the world, right? That's why I make all my own stuff. That must be it. So yes, I'm going to be making a cloak. I have some fabrics here that I shall be using for it. So for the main outer fabric, I have this like dark olive green wool blend. And for the lining, I have this gray plaid flannel that is kind of thin upon, you know, fussing with it now, but I think it's going to look really cool on the inside. This is actually for my capsule wardrobe project, and I had initially planned on it being gray, but I couldn't resist this green, beautiful fabric, so we're going green instead. I found a pattern online that looks pretty promising, but it's a print at home pattern, and it's 60 pages that you would have to then print, tape together, cut out.
That sounds like a lot.
So I think instead I'm just going to try and make my own pattern. I don't think I have enough ink for all of that, and I mean, I'd have to leave my house to go to a store to get ink. That sounds awful. So we're just gonna make it harder for ourselves. So yeah, I will link the pattern below because it does look like a promising start. I'm just going to add a hood to mine. I'm gonna make my own pattern so it doesn't matter. I'm getting very distracted and very hyped about this cloak. So I'm just gonna, you know, start making a mock-up and see what happens, and we're gonna make a cloak. That's that. Let's get into it.
I did start by actually trying to make a pattern, but I came up with a much easier solution that I'll show you here. To start, I drafted a pattern for a half circle skirt using my neck circumference in place of the waist measurement. I like to anchor my measuring tape at the corner and place pins to mark where to cut the fabric. For a fuller cloak, you could use a full circle skirt pattern, but I was only working with 3 meters of fabric, so this is as swooshy as I could go. I laid out my fabric folded in half and followed the measurements provided by my favorite circle skirt calculator to cut out the piece. To shape the shoulders, I folded both of the edges so they met in the middle, like how it'll lay when worn. Then I pinned the sides so they followed the general shape of some shoulders and tried it on as needed to get the right shape. You could also place another piece of clothing on top and follow the slope of the neck and shoulders to get the right shape. I tried it on here and there, and once I was happy with the fit, I sewed it down and trimmed the excess. I also rounded the neckline at both the front and back, making it lower in the front. And when everything was done, I was actually really impressed with the fit. With that finished, I repeated the process with the lining fabric. I used the wool layer as a guide to get the same shape for the lining. I set those pieces aside and began working on the hood pattern. I grabbed a sweater and copied the shape, adding some extra room for seam allowance. I also cut out a rectangle to increase the width of the hood and hopefully help it lay flat and not too pointy on the top. I think I ended up making my hood too short, but it's definitely still wearable. I pinned and sewed the rectangular strip between the 2 layers of the hood with right sides together, then ironed the seams open to the best of my ability. Spraying the fabric with water first helps to get it to cooperate a bit better. For the hood lining, I didn't add a rectangular piece in the middle and instead just cut out 2 layers the same size as the wool layer with extra room for seam allowance. The thin fabric didn't need as much convincing to lay flat, so I thought the rectangular piece wasn't necessary. I decided I wanted to add arm slits in the cloak as well, so I determined where I wanted the slit to be and cut that section off. It would be sewn back together later, leaving a gap in the seam for the arm slit. I used the cut section as a guide to cut off pieces for the remaining side of the cloak as well as the lining fabric. The pieces were then sewn back together for both the lining and outer layers. I made sure to backstitch at the slit openings to strengthen them. Please welcome the addition of some Spider-Man stickers on my sewing machine because my nephew decided to give her a makeover.
New York, Queens. It's a rough borough, but hey, it's home.
After sewing to the top of the slit, I skipped ahead to the bottom, backstitching and continuing to sew down the rest of the seam. I then ironed open those seams, including at the arm slit, again spraying with water to try to coax the fabric to obey me. Bouncing back and forth between parts of this project because of who I am as a person, it was now back to the hood. I put the lining fabric inside of the outer fabric with right sides together, then pinned and sewed them together along the front edge, like where your face will go. After the layers of the hood were sewn together, I sewed the seam allowance down to the lining side. This helps to prevent the lining from peeking out, and then I ironed this edge flat once again. To keep the fabric laying flat around the arm slits, I whip stitched the seam allowances down with tiny stitches that would hopefully be close to invisible from the outside. The lining would then be stitched in by hand at the same spot. Now it was time to attach the hood. I pinned and sewed both layers of the hood into the cloak at the neckline. The lining would soon be sewn in over top to hide the raw edges. I didn't really like the idea of having arm slits and outer pockets, but I still definitely wanted to add pockets, so I opted to add some on the inside. I sketched up a shape that felt right, then cut it out of the lining fabric 4 times to make 2 pockets. I also cut out 2 rectangles of fabric and 2 pieces of iron-on interfacing that would be used to strengthen the pocket opening. I laid the interfacing on the wrong side of the fabric and ironed them together. I determined where I wanted the pocket opening to be and placed the rectangles right side down on the lining. I had drawn a rectangle on the interfacing and stitched around the lines in the same way one would sew a welt pocket. I'll link a video below showing how that's done. Once the interfaced piece was sewn on, I cut the pocket opening, which is just a straight line down the center of the box we just sewed and a little triangle at each end. You want to cut the triangle as close as you can to the box you just stitched without snipping into the stitches. Next, I tucked the interfaced piece inside of the pocket slit and ironed it flat. I think I should have actually sewn the pocket pieces on first before flipping everything inside out, but I didn't do that, so I'm doing that here. Another important thing to note is that the top pocket pieces should have actually been longer to account for them needing to cover the pocket opening, but I didn't do that either. This was remedied by just stitching around the pocket pieces and trimming off the excess of the now too long piece. I wanted my pockets to be pretty strong, so I decided to top stitch some bias tape around the edges. The pockets would live between the layers of the cloak, so I wasn't too concerned with the bias tape being a perfect match for the fabric. If your pocket fabric is pretty sturdy, this probably is an unnecessary step, but mine was pretty thin, so I just wanted to make them a little bit heftier. With the pockets finished, I could get on with finishing the cloak. I began with whip stitching and ironing the front edge of the outer fabric in about 1 centimeter. Then I laid the lining on top of the cloak with wrong sides together. I started by lining up the seams at the hood, covering up the raw edges, then by lining up and pinning the arm slits together, and finally pinning along the front edges of the cloak. Looking back, I wish I had flatlined the pieces, which is where you sew the outer and lining fabrics together first, rather than sewing the 2 layers together separately. The method I used here might have worked better for heavier lining fabrics, but as I've mentioned, mine was quite thin and shifty, so it ended up causing some problems in the end. Flatlining the pieces would have required an extra finishing step along the seams once the pieces were joined together, but I don't mind spending some extra time hand sewing. Speaking of hand sewing, once the outer and lining layers were pinned, I could sew them together. I sewed everything with a slip stitch, making sure to only go through 1 layer of the outer fabric and not poke through to the right side. I then realized I should have added a closure before pinning the layers together, so after the arm slits were finished, I selected some buttons and cut out 2 rectangles of fabric that would act as button loops. The fabric was too thick to sew first and turn out, so I folded it like bias tape and sewed it together by hand. Then I pinned and sewed the loops onto the seam allowance of the cloak fabric by machine, going back and forth a few times so they'd be extra secure. With that, it was back to sewing the lining. As with the arm slits, the front edge was also sewn with a slip stitch. All that was left now was the hem, which was actually the trickiest part of this whole project. Again, if I had flatlined the pieces, it wouldn't have been so bad, but because I hadn't done that, I had a huge amount of lining to pin and I couldn't lay the cloak out flat because of the rounded shoulders. What I ended up doing was putting the cloak on my dress form and laying down underneath it like I was working on a car and pinning it like that. I held my pin cushion between my knees and I had to use my hands and feet to spread the fabric out enough. What a glamorous process! But once that was finished with some more slip stitching, the cloak was done. I really love this cloak. With the hood up, it has more of a fantasy feel, and if I wear the hood down and add a beret, it gives more dark academia vibes. It's surprisingly warm, although it can get a little chilly at the front where the opening is. This is more of a warmer winter days cloak, not a Canadian minus 30 degrees cloak, but I have been wearing it on those slightly warmer days and it does the trick, especially at the back. I have the warmest back now. Having the pockets on the inside actually worked out super well because I can access them without having to move my arms out of the cozy interior. And if you're waiting for the bus or the train in the cold, you can access your inner hobbit and hunker down in your built-in blanket. If I were going to make another cloak, I'd make the hood bigger and flatline the pieces first. But for my first try, I think this was definitely a success. Thank you so much for watching. This video is actually part 2 of my capsule wardrobe series. Make sure you watch part 1 and come back soon for more sewing adventures.